me. And so I just thought it was important. This is, as we go through this, you'll see that this is not just an art issue. It's much more than that. One of the books that I used is called White Jesus, the Architect of Racism. So as we go through this, it gets a little deeper. You'll see how the images of the white Jesus became not something that merged us, but has driven us apart. And that may not be anything that you've ever experienced or even had a sense that that was a reality. But hopefully as we go through this, you'll see what I mean. Okay, there we are. It's really going to come down to these two images. And where do you see Jesus in those two portraits? What? And pardon?
To the left.
Now, both of these will pop up later as I go through all of this. So
We'll start with prayer.
no, we need prayer at the end. Let's see, we'll flip one more. Neil McGregor, who is the former director of the British Museum, wrote, "Christian art is theology in visual form." If we go back to biblical references, specifically in the Old Testament, if you believe that the prophets were talking about Jesus, that's one thing. If you think that the prophets were simply talking in a more generic way about the coming Messiah, that's something different. But here's what the prophets had to say about the coming Messiah. And as Christians, we go back to that to see that as a precursor to Jesus. So Isaiah described the Messiah as having no beauty or majesty. And then the psalmist called the Messiah fairer than the children of men. In Lamentations, there's a verse that supposedly is a reference to the Messiah that states, "Her Nazarites were purer than snow. They were whiter than milk. They were more swarthy in body than rubies. Their polishing was of sapphire. Their visage is blacker than coal." A lot of this goes back to the story of Noah and Ham, one of his sons. If you remember the story of Noah, after the flood, Noah planted a vineyard, and then what happened? He got drunk. Absolutely whatever. And in the story, his sons come upon him. Ham comes upon him lying naked in the tent, drunk. And then the other sons come and they cover him up, but Ham doesn't. And there's all kinds of theological debate about what actually happened, but then Noah curses Canaan, who is Ham's son, and that Ham's descendants are believed to have moved to Africa and lived there through the centuries, and their badness because of the curse became equated with descendants using a mistranslation of Ham as burnt or black. So right from the very beginning in Genesis, the notion of white as good and pure and blackness being bad or evil goes all the way back to the story of Noah. There are no contemporary descriptions of Jesus. There are no paintings, no sculptures. Within the Jewish tradition, it was against Jewish law to portray humans in art. And that carried off actually later into the Islamic faith. And since Christianity was prohibited across the Roman Empire, nobody would want to depict what Jesus may have looked like. During the Middle Ages, a letter appeared that has been found to be a forgery, that actually was written during the Middle Ages, because there are references in the letter to contemporary Middle Ages, medieval things that happened. But this letter, which supposedly was written by Publius Lentulus between 14 and 37 AD, claimed that Jesus was tall, had wavy hair, was rosy-cheeked, and blue-eyed. Again, a forgery from the 13th century. Okay. Within 3 decades following the death of Constantine in 337, images of Jesus began to appear. Constantine's conversion and later sanctioning of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire allowed for a proliferation of depictions of Jesus. For the Roman citizen, a less radical and less brown Jesus made for a better deity and contributed to the making of Jesus white. This is the oldest known portrayal of Jesus, but it's actually a mockery. What you see is a donkey-headed man being crucified on a cross and being worshipped by this Alexandro. And this is taken in one of the catacombs. So there we go. It starts.
I'm sorry, you mentioned the time period.
Pardon?
When was this one? You asked, was there a date for the, as during a first century crucifixion?
Well,
That's the reference to
but
the
it's-
time frame. That's not the when
It's
it
the
was
4th century, early 4th century.
to 300 something.
Yeah, 300 something, I believe. This goes all the way up to the 3rd century, when Christians were still being persecuted. Most Christian art discovered was limited to the catacombs of Rome, and then mostly showed the familiar fish symbol and sometimes the cross. This shows Jesus as the Good Shepherd, a reoccurring image from the Gospel of John. In the Callisto catacombs of Rome, Jesus appears in a very Greek or Roman pose, dressed as a Greek or Roman. This image is taken from an older image from 570 BC in Greek art. So what they were doing in the early Christian church was mimicking previous artwork, the way the Romans did for Greek art, because the Romans weren't very inventive artistically. They just copied all things Greek. Seemed like the thing to do. This is, again, from the 3rd century, from a sarcophagus cover from the Vatican Museum, shows the Magi presenting gifts to the Christ child. The image on the left, I'm pretty sure, is an image of the person buried in the sarcophagus. That's not meant to be Jesus. So we have the three magi, Mary and Joseph, and I think that's probably the angel Gabriel. I don't think it's Joseph. Some of these are hard to see because they are so faint. This is the healing of the paralytic painted during the 3rd century. Was found on a long abandoned wall in a church in Syria. Found in a baptistry. And in the old church, the baptistry was a separate building from the sanctuary because you couldn't go into the sanctuary unless you were baptized. So you couldn't go into the church to be baptized. You got baptized outside in another building. Probably the most famous one is in Pisa. Next to the Leaning Tower, there's another dome-shaped building. That's the baptistry where you went in to get baptized. This is a mural painting from the catacomb of Comodillo. One of the first bearded images of Jesus from the late 4th century, again, the late 300s. We also have a halo. Again, the theology of the art is getting much more intricate.
Complex.
This was painted in the 4th century when Christianity was legal within the Roman Empire. Again, it's in a catacomb of Saint Marcellinus and Peter in Rome. It shows Jesus between Peter and Paul, and then below them, Gorgonius, Peter, Marcellinus, and Tiburtius, 4 martyrs who were buried in the catacomb. And again, notice that Jesus has a halo and is pictured in what's called in majesty in heaven, an image that would become iconic, especially in the Orthodox Church. Everybody in the picture is wearing clothing from the 4th century. Of course, they didn't have archaeology and all of that to really figure out what people may have been wearing. This is a 4th century mosaic from Hinton St. Mary in Dorset, England, it was a Roman villa. And you see the Greek letters for Jesus behind him. No beard. Very mixed messages about what Jesus did or didn't look like. Again, this is very Roman, very Greco-Roman looking. This is Christ Pantocrator, which means he who has authority over everything. It's a Byzantine iconography. The open right hand conveyed the sense of power. And this is the oldest known image of Christ in this pose. It's painted on a wooden board in the 6th century. Now, look at Jesus' face. The left side and the right side are not identical. Notice how the eyes are different. Slightly different expressions on either side of his face. I'm not sure why the artist did that. Maybe to portray yin and yang, I don't know. This is currently in St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai in Egypt. St. Catherine's Monastery holds some of the oldest known Christian manuscripts and artwork anywhere in the world. I was scheduled to go there at one point, but then a war broke out in the Middle East and we had to cancel. This is a Roman mosaic in the Church of Santa Pudenziana in Rome. This is the restored version from the 16th century. This actually is a room over a 2nd century house where the earliest popes lived. So this was their 2nd story, was their church over the papal residence, long before the Vatican, St. Peter's, and all of that were built. This is a high resolution photograph of, as it says, a very heavily eroded Jesus portrait, thought to have been painted in the 6th century. Again, no beard, looks
No long hair.
more Roman, Greco-Roman than Middle Eastern. There seemed at this point, even by the 6th and 7th century, no standard image of what how Christ was going to be portrayed. But that all changed. During what we've called the Dark Ages, which really weren't, from 400 to 800, and into the early medieval period, there were renewed efforts in all of the arts. The Roman perspective of non-whiteness associated with foreigners and the enemy, the portrayal of Jesus as white began to take root. Within the Byzantine Empire, iconography had begun to flourish, but in 726, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III ordered all icons destroyed because they were seen as idolatry. And there continued much debate across the various factions of Christianity, from the Pope in the Western Church and the Emperor in the Eastern Church, about if or how Jesus should be depicted. St. John of Damascus, who lived in the 7th century, wrote 3 treatises defending religious art, writing, "The one who accepted to be seen, the one who accepted to be seen," taken from the Gospel of John, "and I am emboldened to depict the invisible God, not as invisible, but as he became visible for our sake." The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 supported veneration of icons, but not their worship. That meant you could use them to inspire you to worship, but you didn't worship the image. As time progressed, visions of the risen Christ began to be recorded by some of the medieval mystics, adding to the perception of what Jesus may have looked like. Hildegard van Bingen, in the 12th century, she was a poet, composer, wrote of one of her visions, "I saw a serene man coming forth from this radiant dawn, who poured out his brightness into the darkness, and it drove him back with great force, so that he poured out the redness of blood and the whiteness of pallor into it, and struck the darkness such a strong blow that the person who was lying in it was touched by him, took on shining appearance, and walked out of it upright." That vision, along with others by Julian of Norwich from the 15th century, provided more metaphorical images than one of reality. In the Meditations on the Life of Christ, which was written in 1350, the author described Jesus in more human terms. According to Robert Kiley in his book, Fair Jesus, like many medieval thinkers, the author of the Meditations believed that spiritual insight came about through a series of steps. In order to attain a vision of the divine Christ, it is first necessary to recall not the miracle worker, not the person transfigured on the mountain, but the human preacher subject to fatigue, temptation, sorrow, and betrayal. The Reformation brought about pushbacks from the reformers, and in 1511, John Calvin wrote, "We reject the images of Christians. Although Christ assumed human nature, He did not assume it that he might display of figures for making of statues or paintings. Okay. At the same time, St. Ignatius of Loyola, in his spiritual exercises, urged readers to see what was in the Bible with eyes of imagination. Luther, Calvin, and the reformers saw all these images as a road to superstition and perdition. And that's why the reformers went through, as Protestants took over areas of Europe, especially like the Netherlands, Belgium, the lowlands. They literally stripped the churches of everything, including the stained glass, because all of that was seen as idolatry and you didn't need it and it wasn't appropriate. As to the painting of Jesus as white, that color has long been associated with goodness and purity, and that may have added to the reason Jesus was portrayed as white. That understanding would also lead to a justification for racism in Jesus' name. The reality during the medieval period and beyond was that for an artist to get work, Jesus had to be white. Any other color was seen as heresy. Following for some random, okay, now we're going to just look at some random paintings of Jesus up through the centuries. This is the Resurrection by Piero della Francesca from 1460. Aldous Huxley, after calling it the greatest painting in the world, wrote, "The body of Jesus is perfectly developed like that of a Greek athlete. The face is stern and pensive, the eyes cold. The whole figure is expressive of physical and intellectual power. It is the resurrection of the classical ideal, grander and more beautiful than the classical reality from the tomb where it had lain so many hundred years." So is that the way Jesus probably really looked? He looks like somebody that just stepped off a track meet, or better, with his six pack, as they say today. There's a lot of, go ahead.
And this is about 100 years. This is about 80 years before some of the reformers start making some of those statements.
Yes.
This one is about 100 years before that.
Right.
So these would be among some of the images that they were like saying we should.
They've got to go.
They've got to go. Okay.
There's a lot more to this painting than just Jesus. The figures that are lying there, I didn't write it all down, but there's a whole description of their poses. The one guy with the kind of the bluish hat, if you look carefully, he has no legs. The artist really didn't care about anybody else in particular except Jesus. This is Christ Among the Doctors by the Master of the Catholic Kings in Spanish, 1495. Jesus as a youth discussing with the learned men in the temple. That's now in the National Gallery of Art. Everybody's white. Well, maybe not everybody. There's a guy in the back that looks a little dark. Raphael, Raphael painted a number of Madonnas. This is Madonna of the Grand Duke. It has that title because the Grand Duke Ferdinand III was the one who had it painted. But that kind of image of the baby Jesus and Mary perpetuated time and time and time again. And of course, this from the Sistine Chapel, which was 1508 to 1512, God and Adam. Even Adam was white. So was God.
And Luther wrote his theses in 1535. Is that about right?
Yeah.
So this is about like 20 years before Luther nails his theses to
Right.
the door. It's not long, really.
No. Now, these are two different images of Saint Christopher carrying the infant Christ child across the river. And this is what it said. After reaching the other shore, Christopher sat down to rest and asked the child why he became so heavy. I am the Christ child that you carried across the river, and you were also carrying the burdens of the world that I always carry. Then the Christ child vanished.
I've heard the word Christopher, from Greek meaning Christ bearer, the word.
Yeah, and of course
Christ bearer.
and the St. Christopher's Medal for safe travels and all of that, but that's where the whole things come from.
Is that based on a vision that he had,
Who had?
Saint Christopher, of having the Christ child? Does that come from a vision that Saint
I'm-
Christopher had of having the child?
That I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Can't know everything.
Oh, just in case you did, because you know a lot.
This is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is Thomas Aiken's crucifixion. It's the only biblical subject Aikens undertook in his artistic career. Aikens was an agnostic, and he used a 16-year-old student, J. Lori Wallace, as a model. And they went somewhere in Philadelphia, and he had the kid pose repeatedly in different positions. So then, and he took his sketches and went back and painted this. When it first went on display, critics and the public considered it revolting. Probably because it's so dark more than anything else. It's a painful image.
Why did they consider it revolting, do we know?
I didn't write it down, but the critics had a whole lot to say about the painting as a whole, because it was so dark, because Jesus' face was obscured, because
Is it because it's a crucifixion too, as opposed to a?
well,
Basically,
and they probably knew that as an agnostic painting a picture of Christ, that he couldn't put into it what they thought
His faith.
the feeling and the power that should go with it.
being Aikens, it was very well represented,
Yes,
and that bothered them.
yes. It does, when you go to the museum and you see it, it does capture you.
I had no idea it existed.
Yeah. It's
I've
on
seen
one
it.
wall in,
I've seen Aikens paintings, but I didn't know this existed.
yeah.
Mhm.
One of my favorite paintings of all time, The Last Supper by Salvador Dali. Dali was known for his surrealism, but he was also a mystic and a Roman Catholic. He painted this in 1955. Took him 9 months to complete it, and he incorporated his interest in science and optical illusions. I've told the story before. I saw this for the first time in New York City. On Columbus Circle, there's a building that's now, I think it's a tourism building, but it used to be an art gallery. And Salvador Dali's paintings were on the upper levels. And as you came down, the lower levels were all Grandma Moses. So there was a real contrast of artistic style. Again, these are just random pictures. With white Jesus down through the centuries. All right, the history of making Jesus white has had a major impact on Jesus as a symbol of white racism. It isn't just how Jesus was shown as white, but what that meant in culture and how Jesus and whiteness was used to subjugate non-white peoples. That's been true across American history on this continent and abroad. So now we're going to go into this whole notion of Jesus' whiteness and what it has meant. I'm going to start with these three pictures by Heinrich Hoffmann. They're all at Riverside Church. The Christ in Gethsemane on the right is actually in a little alcove in the narthex. The other paintings are in their fellowship hall.
And were they commissioned for Riverside?
No, I think just
But they acquired them.
Rockefeller bought them.
They acquired them somehow.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have Jesus at 33. That's the one on the left. Then Jesus in the temple, and then Christ in Gethsemane. The picture of Jesus at 33, well, from 1880, became a very popular image of Jesus through the years. I've seen that in a lot of different places at different times. But now we're going to come to the one image that all good Protestants know. Do we have copies of it here at the church?
If not in really public view right now,
Okay.
but one of the ways I was saying, and replicated for Protestant funerals very often on the funeral cards.
Right.
Like
Well,
it's in use in a lot of places
Well,
when, yeah.
This is the head of Christ, probably the most reproduced image of Jesus. It was painted in 1940 for distribution by the Church of God and their publishing
Interesting.
house. Salmon, who was born in 1892 and died in 1968, had made original sketches in 1924 following a 2 a.m. vision he had. Now listen to this. By the end of the 20th century, over 1/2 billion, with a B, copies of this picture had been distributed. It was everywhere. Wallet cards.
I grew up with that in my bedroom. My grandmother was a member of this church.
Had a copy of it, yeah.
Yes.
It's I think almost every church I've served in, there
There's
was a
been
copy
someone.
on a wall somewhere in that church. Jesus is fair-skinned, blue eyes, and long, curly, blondish hair. That became the predominant view of Jesus in the late 20th century.
Was that true in Europe too? Or
Not so much.
We're really
No,
talking about
we're talking
more in
about-
particular the United States.
Pardon?
How many images?
500 million.
Half a billion.
For the bait, right?
Yep.
So when you also say that about the dating, right? And this is just me being like a little bit of a church geek or living the life of the pastor. It also coincides not that much with how much cheaper the replication of images
yeah.
becomes. So like if we think about that with the Reformation, part of what was happening from a technological standpoint was that the printing press was invented. And so
Right.
all of a sudden you could put into print and put in the native languages or start translating and getting things out there. Mimeograph machines and that sort of thing were
Right.
starting to show up in every church.
Yep.
You know, there didn't used to be bulletins 120 years ago.
Nope.
Well,
the hymnals didn't even print the music. They just printed the words.
Right.
Was this popular in the Roman Catholic Church also or not?
Not as much. This was more a Protestant image, but they printed wallet size and gave them to servicemen going overseas.
With the war.
It was just everywhere. I don't know how much the Church of God made off of this. But anyway.
Interesting.
So that's the 20th century image of Jesus. Now we're going to start talking about how the image of Jesus and the Christian image of the white Jesus has impacted society. This is a painting called American Progress, painted in 1872, was an attempt to illustrate manifest destiny and what has been termed the Great Commission from Acts 1:8, which is go and make disciples of all people. Gasp's presentation of a shadowy figure holding, it's not a Bible, but it says on its school book, chases Native Americans away as white settlers follow behind, taking over the land. According to the authors of the book White Jesus, The pursuit of curing pagans of their barbaric ways in the name of progress has given conquest a religious zeal that has manifested in many movements and forms throughout history. The French philosopher Ernest Renan, in his 1864 work, The Life of Jesus, wrote, Jesus rid himself of his Jewish traits, thus becoming the first civilized Christian. Nothing we call civilization had reached the Jews of Jesus' time, although goodness among them was often superficial and without depth. Their habits were quiet, and they were in some degree intelligent and shrewd. Jesus was exempt from almost all the defects of his race. The notion of Jesus as white became a hallmark of the Aryan ideology within the Nazi regime. They were claimed that the area of Galilee where Jesus was born was a non-Jewish region, and thus he was a white non-Jew. For colonizers, a white Jesus put the European colonizers with their fair skin on the side of God, and that meant they could enforce caste systems in South America, slavery, and the suppression of Native Americans and Africans. The result was that the white Jesus became an essential tool in the fight for the souls of slaves everywhere. During the 19th century, Christianity spread principally by New England Protestant missionaries to the Pacific, brought with it white exploitation of the Bible to justify slavery and conversion. The first influx of missionaries to Hawaii showed respect for the islanders and brought about making their language as a written language, including the first Hawaiian language Bible in 1839. However, later missionaries banned the Hawaiian language, hula dancing, and began to radically alter the educational systems to transmit a white religion understanding of all things. It was even asked by arriving missionaries in those earliest days, can these be human beings? Now, you had a sense of some of that when you were in Hawaii. Yeah.
Also, the Hawaiian language only has 14 alphabets.
Yes, originally there were more, but it was pared down to 14.
And that was the missionaries trying
Yes.
to make sense of the language.
Right.
And in trying to make sense of it, try and figure out how to write it. And so they created the written language that they then taught the native people, but at the same time,
Right.
yep. Interesting, complicated history.
Right. Now, closer
is-
to home,
Very close to home.
the
Oops, sorry guys.
Carlisle Indian Industrial School,
Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
yep, run by Richard Henry Pratt. Pratt wrote, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. And that's what he attempted to do. A lieutenant, U.S. Army, Pratt was born in 1840, was a staunch proponent of cultural assimilation. He established the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, on a former Army base. And during the school's history, from 1879 to 1918, 36,000 Native Americans from 140 tribes were schooled at Carlisle. The school became a model for 26 off-reservation schools around the country. Native Americans had their hair cut, name changed, and lived, worked, and were schooled in a quasi-military surrounding. Pratt's objective was to help the Indians.
And if the way I understand that history correct, of course, the educating was of minor children. So minor children were taken from their native families,
Yeah.
were just taken from their native families and enrolled in the boarding school.
Right.
As an aside, there's been in the past year discussions about representatives from tribes coming out to Carlisle and repatriating
Some
tribes they can identify.
Right.
Genealogy, genetics, and sending them back to their respective home tribes' burial grounds.
Right.
Because Carlisle, Pennsylvania falls within the bounds of this annual conference, our annual conference of Eastern Pennsylvania of the Methodist Church has actually worked on and studied a lot of this history and has actually worked to have services of repentance and acknowledgement of it. And there are some strong United Methodist roots in the implementation of the school and what was happening there. And so on beyond the local church level, right, at the conference level, our 400 churches in Eastern Pennsylvania at annual conference, there's been a number of discussions, you know, and services as a way to begin to be educated about our very local history and, you know, an opportunity to understand it. And
Published anything?
I'm sure there are things published. I don't have the resources to hand, but I'm sure there are.
And then as a Catholic, recently Pope Francis
Right.
went out to
Canada.
to apologize
Yep.
formally for a cultural impositions that the Catholic Church did upon the tribes out there trying to change their culture.
The Upper New York Conference has for years been involved in apologizing because the entire Iroquois Nation populated New York State. And so we still have a number of reservations within the bounds of the conference. Let's see. Education, even with the Christian roots, can serve to mold people to serve dominant social interest. In the Carlisle School, children spent half of the day in religious settings like the chapel or classroom and spent half of the day learning industrial training, which simply meant manual labor. Schools modeled after Carlisle continued to be run by military leaders through the 1930s. And then further along the spectrum, the movement to adopt out children of one color other than white once more can be seen as a process of assimilation into a white Christianized social structure. The question of adopting transracially raised several questions, not the least of which are this, I should have printed this out, but these were the sentiments of children, Native American children adopted by white people. So if you think transracially, which could be any number of different ways, make sure you buy all of the essential items for your child. One, let's see, set your child up for life. The most important items to have are 1 healthy dose of self-hatred, 2 spoonfuls of gratitude, a cupful of desire to look just like you, a lifetime of racism, a ricochet of resilience. And those were all quoted from what kids had to say about growing up adopted in transracial families. Birth of the Nation, 1915, D.W. Griffith, was a blockbuster movie. It had a huge distribution across the country. It was based on the novel The Klansman by Thomas Dixon, which claimed to portray the saving grace of the Ku Klux Klan against the corrupt Black supremacist, terrifying innocent whites. Now, Dixon, who wrote the original book, had been a college roommate of Woodrow Wilson's. And when Wilson was president, he screened Birth of a Nation at the White House. And Supreme Court Chief Justice Edward White, commenting at the screening that he too had once been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. The film was the biggest grossing film for the next 20 years. Has anybody here ever seen it? Yeah, no, it's a very wrenching film. Of course, it's just.
This is silent. This is 20 years to take this to 1935.
Yep.
Showing that when basically everything converted.
After the First World War.
People wanted to see it.
And it's still active.
Well, yeah, that's this next. The Ku Klux Klan membership soared to over 6 million as a result of the film's distribution. A prerequisite for membership in the KKK was, guess what? Being a white Protestant Christian. At the same time, at the same time of Birth of a Nation, African Americans were coming of age in the Harlem Renaissance, which had taken hold in New York City and across the nation. It presented a problem for Black Christians who had long lived with the picture of a white Jesus. To many African American Christians, as one pastor in Harlem noted, the white Christ was a problem. He represented a type of Christianity that served only to instigate Black suffering. The God represented by the white Christ could be described as sadistic. He was a transcendent pedagogue who stood at a distance, coming near only to chastise the sinner with misery. Black Christians identify Black suffering with Jesus' suffering. As time has gone by, portraits of a white Jesus began to be questioned in Black churches, some being replaced by imagery more in tune with the Black understanding. One individual was quoted as saying, "The Jesus you saw in all the Black Baptist churches looks like the people who were beating you up in the streets and setting dogs on you." Why is the world filled, and the question was raised, why is the world filled with depictions of a white Jesus when the history says otherwise? My mother can remember growing up in Oswego, seeing crosses burning on the hill above her house from the Ku Klux Klan. That would have been in the 20s, upstate New York. So here's some movies that show Jesus. Looks like just anybody you might meet on the street in Philadelphia. Jeffrey Hunter, blue eyes, perfect teeth. Max von Sydow in The Greatest Story Ever Told. And then Mel Gibson's The Passions of Christ. Perpetuating the image of a white. Pardon?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Oh, big time.
Lots of controversy.
Mel Gibson is a conservative Christian, Roman Catholic. And his belief is that the more blood Jesus shed, the purer we became. So if you saw the movie, And I only went to see it because many people were talking about it. And I figured, well, I can't talk about it or say it's no good if I haven't seen it. It's a bloody movie. And part of the reality is some of that blood was being spread around in the presence of the Pharisees and Sadducees and everything. And that would have put them out. They would have had to go through, what is it, 7 days of cleansing, purifying and
So in some
everything.
ways you're saying there wasn't
Not a reality to it.
there wasn't a not historic, I don't know if historical,
Yeah,
yeah,
it wasn't accurate.
it wasn't theologically,
No.
yeah.
And supposedly there's a sequel coming out on the resurrection. Now, I haven't heard a lot more about that. I didn't like the movie. There were parts of it that just really annoyed me, both from a theological standpoint and as a theater person. But anyway.
It was highly controversial. There were some churches that sent busloads of people to see the movie.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And other churches, it was totally banned.
Oh, yeah.
It's brutal.
Yeah, I never saw it. Like reading all the
It's tough to
articles.
watch.
Oh, you don't need to see it. I wouldn't.
Yeah, I see that, yeah.
You don't need to see it.
I mean, they're scourging and they're scourging. Right?
Oh, I know. Yeah. Whoopsie, I skipped there. Now, this is a modern rendition of a Middle Eastern individual at the time of Jesus.
Who's that?
Pardon?
Who's that?
Let me finish. Taken from anthropological studies and forensic work, this is a 2001 BBC computer image that suggested how Jesus may have looked.
Why don't you say that again so everybody can hear it again?
It's an image,
computer
a computer generated image based on anthropological and forensic studies of skulls and everything from the period.
Structural,
that's what forensic anthropologists do. And this would have been a typical Middle Eastern person from 2,000 years ago. Now, obviously the hair could be longer, shorter, the beard, whatever, but it's dark skinned, dark eyes. And he would have been bearded. Jewish men were bearded. Now, I also read in some places that some evangelicals in this country have made the claim that if God had wanted Jesus to be white, he would have been white. And so some American evangelicals claim Jesus was white because that's what God wanted.
Who decides what God wants?
Evangelicals, didn't you know that? If that were true, Jesus would have stood out in a crowd. And when you come to the time of Judas having to identify Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he would not have gone over to have to kiss him to identify him. He would have stood out in the crowd. The claim of a white Jesus continues to perpetuate the claim that dark-skinned people are bad, less than human, and need to be brought under control or eliminated. For the white Christian, it means that if they are to live, they have to be made as white as possible. So, that didn't take too long. How do we go about telling the story of the white Jesus history? Is it important to tell? Is it not important? Unimportant, is this a subject that the church needs to explore? Or is it just I'll let it go. It's art. It doesn't mean anything. You know, we are all pretty much WASPs in this room, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
So are you asking us from the standpoint as a local church or as
Well, I think
something
it-
more than that?
Well, I
right?
think it's a
Both
it's
ends.
rhetorical question, but it's also, you know, is it an issue that has ever come up? Or has it always been, well, of course, that's Jesus right over there on the wall. You know, that's what he looked like. That's how I see him. And that's all there is to it.
The other thing I'd say about that, no matter what you do, I would go to a church that African American and go, nice, tall, Jesus, different. That, you know, basically,
Different depiction.
yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with it. It wouldn't bother me. But in a church like this, where it's basically all white, I don't have any problem with that either. It's what you're comfortable with, I think. That's what it's all about, right?
Right.
I mean, the artist did it based on their comfort of.
Well, and also how they were getting paid is one of the things that,
Okay.
no, I mean, seriously, I mean, I think that, you know, art wasn't necessarily just for enrichment, right?
Right.
It was also a trade. It was also,
Right.
it was also a line of work. Yeah.
Like I
So
said,
for those of you that are online, do you want to repeat what John just said? Or do you want me to repeat what John just said? John just said that in response to that question, that, you know, if he was to go into worship in an African-American church and would see depictions of Jesus that were African-American, he wouldn't necessarily maybe feel, you didn't use this word, but I think what you were getting at was you wouldn't necessarily feel challenged by that. It, you know, you would embrace it perhaps as part of the experience of worshiping with that church. That being said, being here in Willow Grove, images of Jesus that are predominantly white don't necessarily challenge him, or they feel comfortable because that's the environment within which you've grown up. So, I mean, I think what I hear Rick saying is, do we as a white church, a predominantly Caucasian church, are we particularly challenged? Do we have a responsibility to learn some of this history, to engage some of this history, and to challenge our own perhaps replication over and over and over again of a Jesus that only looks like us?
Well, I would also say, I felt about this too. If we were at that stage in our church where we were gaining membership and the African Americans were coming in, and they became a larger part of the population of the church over time, I wouldn't have any problem with people saying, you know, we're tired of this image of Jesus. Can't we change this? And I would be on their side. I wouldn't fight that at all. Okay. But, you know,
but by the same token, if we don't have those images, we're not going to attract,
well,
potentially not attract people of other races.
So I agree. Sense of message. Quietly.
It's a, you know,
Yeah, good point.
Don't you usually picture what you're familiar with?
true,
That's what makes sense to you.
Yes.
That's what you grew up with.
right?
That's what you have a relation with.
Right.
I don't think he's challenging that part of it.
No, I think that, you know, the images that I showed are comfortable for us. Even the ones from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, you know, we've lived with those, and that's part of the heritage that we grew up with. The fact that they're inaccurate, especially costume-wise, you know, they were all painted like they were contemporaries of the artist instead of historical figures. That can be a little disconcerting, but I did not include in this pictures of Jesus from an Asian perspective or an African perspective.
As long as we're not using those pictures against someone.
Well, I think that's what it really.
No matter how we represent Jesus, as long as we don't use this representation to put down someone else.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it is, you know, are we using the images that we have of Jesus to denigrate others because they don't look like that?
Yes, Laura, I've heard scholars mention that Christ as having been Aramaic and implying olive skin and swarthy features.
Right.
And for that matter, in the Catholic faith, there are sections that regard the Blessed Virgin Mary as Black Madonna, be it in
Right.
statue form or in art form.
Right.
And it doesn't seem to be a problem, so that there are groups that venerate, not worship, but venerate
Right.
Black Madonna. So even suggesting Ethiopia as part of a sphere of and the whole Middle Eastern facial features as having a darker tone has no problem for me. You would expect that in that region of the world.
Right.
So why being whitewashed clearly and figuratively? Why has more to do with motivation for commission?
I think.
Could you guys online, if you guys online wanted to open your microphones and let us know if you can hear things or can't hear things or whatever, you couldn't hear. You can't hear. So what Tony was saying is that within the Catholic tradition, Ethiopian Black Madonna, like he feels like there's definitely a certain permissiveness or openness to receiving and other images and that sort of thing, and are even circulated. Did I say that well?
Well, see, this is the problem now, because I understand what he's saying, but I always thought that the Black Madonna had to do with church in Poland, particular location.
There are a number of Black Madonnas all over Europe.
Oh, okay, that I didn't know.
Some more famous than others, obviously.
Yeah.
I think the one that you're referring to is also associated with the church in Doylestown.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a number of.
So there's a number of.
Yeah.
Even in Mexico, when I was at the National Cathedral in Washington, they show different grottos, caves, with different statues of Madonna, and one from Mexico.
Where's the whole idea of Black Madonna come from?
It's an artist's vision.
The same place the white Madonna had Christ came from.
Right, yeah.
So the question in the room was, so if there are newer depictions or there are more depictions that either we're becoming aware of or are being replicated now of an African-American Madonna, where did that idea come from? So that was sort of the question that was behind that. Do you guys have any questions that are online? Is there anything that, or any responses that you would want to offer to the questions that Rick answered about or asked about a responsibility that we might have to learn more of this history, to either work to share it or not perpetuate images that have supported racism in America? Any thoughts there? Anybody want to unmute? Sorry, I was trying to show you the other people that are in the room with this other camera, but John, did you want to say anything? No, he's good. He's good. Laura, are you good? She's good.
This is the book White Jesus that I referenced several times. I'll show you the cover. On the one side of the cover, you have a traditional version of Christ. On this side, you have a drawing. And this drawing was actually done by the young man that shot up the Baptist church in the South a couple years ago.
Carolina.
Yeah.
AME Church, right? It was
Was in Amy, was in Charleston.
no, Charleston.
either Charleston or
It was Charleston.
But anyway, that's,
African church.
That was the year that that was within weeks of when I started here, 2015, like June of 2015.
and all of this,
Right after we were there.
yeah, all of this discussion started with this book that I got called Fair Jesus, the Gospels according to Italian painters from 1300 to 1650. So there's a lot of artwork in there. Which one you want?
Oh.
I've still got a bunch of bookmarks in here in case we needed more quotes. This is a difficult book to read.
Oops.
Because
Sorry, guys.
it tends to be textbooky, but it also is very slanted toward this whole notion of the white Jesus and the architecture of racism in religion and education. And it's a really good book. If anybody would like to borrow it, you may. Within reason, I'll take out my bookmarks.
A lot of these books actually come from PhD people.
Well, yeah, this is by a group of authors who all knew each other from college. And they all ended up with PhDs and everything. And
Spent a lot of time thinking about it.
and then, strangely enough, I ended up picking this up at the library book sale, The Jesus of Hollywood. And this book just came out, I think. Well, 2007.
You were saying about this one being academic.
Yeah.
So the writers together are, one of them has a PhD from the Rosser School of Education and University of South Carolina. Another one from Azu Pacific University and a PhD from Claremont Graduate School, Wheaton College. It seems like they all know each other from this Azua Pacific University. All four of them know each other from that place. And then this is the other one he was just talking
And
about.
that's a really good study of all of the movies that have been made that portray Jesus. So, any questions?
Is there any new iconography being perpetuated in terms of projecting Christ as more Middle Eastern now?
I haven't seen anything.
So the question was from Tony about any new iconography being produced in order to support a different, more Middle Eastern depiction of Christ. And that would most specifically be in the Eastern tradition, iconography, I think of.
Yeah, but even, I think images of a Black Jesus perpetuate within Black churches. An Asian, especially Korean image of Jesus. I have a painting at home of a nativity scene that's from Japan. And they only seem to be able to get a footing within that ethnic group. There doesn't seem to be a lot of cross-pollination, if you will. And I think that's because, as Eliane said, you surround yourself with what you're familiar with and what you're comfortable with. If we were to take everything out of here that has a religious significance and replace it with something radically different, it probably would make people very uncomfortable. Stained glass windows tend to be a little more generic, especially here. The big window with Jesus isn't really a portrait of a white Jesus, as Tiffany very often portrayed him. I don't personally I don't think there's going to be much of a shift. The only shift might be in the use of the image of a white Jesus to try to dominate another culture. You know, that's what we've done, you know, the European
Yeah,
colonizers
yeah.
across Africa, the Protestant missionaries in the Pacific, European colonizers in South America and Central America. You know, look at what the conquistadors did, and they brought with them their friars to Mexico and South America, Pizarro and everything. And anything they found of a religious significance, they destroyed. And there's like only two. One of the friars that was with Cortez, I think, wrote and recorded a lot of images of the Aztecs. And I think one or two of those exist in Europe in museums. And that's about the only relevant information we have contemporary with when the colonizers took over and destroyed culture. We're very good at using our religion to destroy other cultures. If they're not like us, then they're gonna be, you know, like the Carlisle school, you know, cut their hair, change their name.
And the
Um,
cut their hair was specifically traumatic. It wasn't just
Oh,
that
yeah.
it helped make young boys look like white
White boys.
Caucasian young boys. You know, it assimilated the significance of the cutting the hair from within the Native American tradition. Hair is only cut when someone dies. So imagine pulling children from their homes, away from their parents, forcing them into what would, I mean, honestly, I think we could call it what would feel like a bit of a concentration camp, right? You've sort of been pulled completely out of that. You've been put in new clothes. All the clothes that you have been stripped. You've been given new attire, so you look like the other young boys. And then in your tradition, the cutting of hair is representative of only being done when there is death. And then all of the boys would have had their, boys and girls had their hair cut.
And new language.
And only a new language spoken, right? So the trauma upon the trauma, you know,
It's
of,
just-
which is what they were saying about a dose of self-hatred, right? That everything that you come from, you know, all of a sudden you're being taught to hate, dismiss, throw away.
Yep.
While in our white Protestant and even Methodist churches, it was being promoted that this was a good thing, a cause worthy of contributing towards or being involved in, because it was gonna hate the culture, hate the native,
You know,
but save the man, save the soul,
Yeah.
you know,
kill the Indian, but save the man.
soul, save the soul, save the man.
No, it said
Yeah,
save the man.
save
It just changed the outward appearance and the thinking, but save the body.
In the first place, who are we to say we're saving the soul?
Not around here, but in the West also.
Jillian, he realized he interrupted you. What were you saying? He said,
Who are we to pretend that we're saving the soul? We're not saving any souls.
No, that's true.
We're
Well,
human
the Catholics were
beings.
just as Jody sending the Jesuits out
Yeah.
to save the barbarians and the pagans out in the Midwest.
Well,
Tried.
and so many of the explorers brought Jesuits with them. Those were the friars that came with them because they could write and they could record things.
They're the warrior
Yeah.
group of the missionary arm
Yep.
of the Catholic Church. They were trained to go out into harm's way, so to speak. Rationalized, justified that they were doing God's will by burning the savages.
so for those of you guys that are online, I know it's probably getting really hard, the discussion piece, because of the way people's voices are bouncing around and probably having a hard time hearing that. And I'm not sure right now. I just did a good job of trying to repeat all that. And that might be kind of hard, but this highlights that I will work to see what kind of an additional microphone system, so that if you found this helpful, you've been grateful to participate, please let me know that you've been grateful to participate, and that we might try and get an additional microphone system that would pick it up within the room, like one of those old conference call things that we can plug in and do it. So maybe we'll sign off. So you guys, I don't know how much more conversation we're gonna have here, but thank you for coming, and look forward to hearing from you, and just be in touch, okay?
I guess I did. Yeah, I don't have anything more other than next month we'll look at Native American art, interestingly enough, piggybacking. And some of the mythology of the various sections of the United States. The United States can be broken up into areas of jurisdiction of different kinds of Native Americans, Indians, from the Northeast to the Central, the South, Southwest, Northeast. And each of the tribes and associations within those areas had similar understandings, although so much of the Native American understanding of mythology was the same across the board. And not unlike the mythology of the Greeks and the Romans, and there's a certain universality about especially creation imagery. So, and then in November, we're going to do a Sunday. I'm going to talk about Safe Haven, the Holocaust location where 1,000 refugees were brought to this country in World War II to be saved from the Nazis, which is my hometown.
Mhm.
But I think of what the Jesus looked like, there's that cartoon, I think